Hello, and welcome back to The Front Page. Good to have you back with us again today. My name is Andrew McKeever. I'm the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. We're going to be talking today about an issue that has faded somewhat from the headlines since last spring, but is probably very likely to come back front and center very quickly. Sort of overshadowed a bit in recent weeks by Hurricane Irene and concerns about the economy and economic downturn. But the issue of health care, or rather how to pay for it, commonly referred to as single-payer health care, is one that is likely to return to us very shortly as the legislature gets back to work in Montpelier in a few months. That issue, as many of you know, is a very complicated and thorny one. The legislature spent a fair amount of time during this last session this spring talking it over, and wound up passing a bill that would, at least on its face, set us on a course towards something that is referred to as a single-payer health plan, where a single state entity would pay for our health insurance costs. But the devil is in the details, as they all say, and to help us unravel some of those details today, we have with us Wendy Wilton, who is the city treasurer for Rutland. And Wendy, welcome to GNAT.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice to be here.
Thank you for making the trip down here to talk with us about, as I said, this very complicated issue. Wendy, in addition to being the treasurer of the city of Rutland, is also going to be a member of a panel on a healthcare forum that will be held up in Burlington on November 8th, sponsored in part by Vermont Tiger, the website. You can find out more information about this forum on their website, vermonttiger.com. Wendy's going to be part of a rather distinguished panel, as far as I can see, that will be talking about this issue. And again, that's going to be up in Burlington on November 8th. Before she became the treasurer of Rutland, she was also had a career in banking and was also a small business advisor with the Small Business Association here in Vermont. So I think we have a real good number cruncher here to help us work through all this. So given that, Wendy, I mean, I guess the real question that always seems to come up, at least it certainly seemed to come up a lot last spring, as I recall, is the whole business of how do the numbers parse out on this? Is, when we're all done, when everything is sugared off, is single payer or what has been described as single payer, I know that term is not used officially in the legislation, is it likely to save money, or is it going to be at best cost neutral, as far as you can tell?
I think there's actually a possibility it will cost a lot more, and that the work that I've done in my projection indicates that the cost savings will not be enough to offset some increase in cost due to healthcare costs increasing as a function of the economy, and also greater utilization and greater numbers of folks who would be incorporated into the plan.
Now, where are these increased costs supposed to come from? Because I guess part of the attraction of this was that our current hybrid system, I guess, if you will, of public and private health care gave us a very expensive system that wasn't providing very good health care, at least when it was compared to other countries. Why should a single payer cost more? What's going to cause those costs to escalate beyond what we're already paying in total?
Well, the way that I've seen it also from some of the analysis that the state has done is they do acknowledge that healthcare cost increases will continue. Even Dr. Shao understands that very basic function in the economy. He
was the expert that the state brought in and had gave a report.
Sure. Because you have fuel costs and insurance costs and the cost of employees and things like that never go down, it goes up. And the other piece is utilization. That's we're an aging demographic in the United States as a whole, but also particularly in the state of Vermont. So that's something that really shouldn't be ignored. So I believe that, and there'll be some greater utilization too, because while it's a laudable goal to provide universal coverage, it means that there will be more cost by virtue of that. So that's where I think the cost increases come from, a couple of different general places. One is the economy in general is going to yield greater, just through inflationary pressures, cost increases, which we know in healthcare have outstripped the ability of the economy to grow. And then we've got utilization, that other piece. So when you look at that, it's a question of, do the proposed savings, are they enough to combat those increases? And I believe that they will not be. The first couple of years, it might look pretty good, but at the end of the day, at the end of a 5-year period, I believe the state will be looking at somewhere between $1 billion and a $2 billion cumulative cash shortfall, unless large tax increases are passed to accommodate the funding.
Well, that's a pretty substantial amount of money in
It
a
is.
small state like Vermont, where our total state budget is
Well,
somewhere
general
between
fund is
yeah.
1.1 billion.
Right.
Education fund is 1.3 billion. What I have done in my work, Andrew, is take a look as if we created a healthcare fund at the state level, which we would for this, and what is the expense and revenue. And we're talking about a fund that really, from the get-go, is almost $4 billion. So it's more than the general fund and the education fund today combined.
Well, walk us through what kind of where we're at now at this point, and what the legislation that the legislature passed last May, I think it was, gets us to. I mean, the last thing we heard about it was the appointment of a 5-member board, headed by Ann Rader Wallach, I believe, who was one of the principal advocates for a single pay rate. I use that term loosely, but I guess that's.
Oh, she was the administration's point person on healthcare reform.
Right. So where do things stand at the moment? I guess, are they still kind of researching things, or trying to figure out where they're going to find these savings, or kind of what's been going on in the last 6 months or so?
The bill was passed in May. The 5-member board has been appointed. Their task, which I don't envy, is to set rates for all healthcare procedures, to determine hospital global budgets, which I'd love to talk about if we have a few moments.
Sure.
To determine what the benefit structure is for Green Mountain Care, which is the hoped-for single-payer program that would come about a little bit later as we go through this process. Everything having to do with healthcare in Vermont will be their decision. And frankly, I think it'd be a little bit scary to be a member of that board. I have friends who've served on the hospital board in my area. It takes, at least a few months and maybe a year for somebody to really understand the finances of a hospital in terms of, reimbursements from Medicare and Medicaid, and how does that all work, and how do you make ends meet, and how do you make it all happen. I can't imagine being confronted with the level of decision-making that they've got to do, and for some of them, learning on the fly about many of those very complex financial systems. So I don't envy their task. One concern that I have, though, is that the state of Vermont, we Vermonters, will not know what this benefit package will be, and will not know who will be covered and how it will be funded and who will pay until 2013. So that's a little over a year from now. And what concerned me and got me going on developing my projection was the fact that the legislature passed this bill without asking the Joint Fiscal Office to do like maybe 10, 15, 20 different scenarios about what this healthcare fund would look like, given certain funding mechanisms, given certain benefit structures. They could have done exactly what I did. I've done this in my part-time based on information I found from state websites, BISHCA, the Joint Fiscal Office, stuff like that. No reason that they couldn't have done that, and they didn't. And I'm very disappointed that they didn't, because I believe that would have maybe given them a little pause to say, we kind of need to know where we're going. It was very clear that the governor understood where he was going. What started me on this process was that I heard the governor speak in February of 2011 when the bill was just being introduced by the administration. And he told the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, we had a luncheon in Montpelier, and I'm an active member, and I went, and he said, I want to produce a catamount-style benefit for all Vermonters, universal coverage, again, a laudable goal. And he said, I want to pay for it with a payroll tax, which is what Shao has proposed, but that's where Shao stops. Shao talks about the savings that he can produce through, different changes to the system. But he says, we're going to pay for it through a payroll tax. But he never marries the two things in a projection, as I have done. So I heard the governor say that pretty clearly. And he even said, we're thinking about an 11% payroll tax on the employer and a 3.5% payroll tax on the employee. Well, that got me started thinking, you know what? That might be worth looking at, but I got to test drive that on paper. That was how I was thinking. So it got me going on the research. But what I found after I started digging and putting this thing together, that 14.5% payroll tax was not going to carry the day.
Wasn't going to raise enough money to offset the additional costs.
Right. And a lot of people in Montpelier said, yeah, we know that, and we think the whole thing falls of its own weight. And I kind of thought very differently, because the bill specifically says that the Bishka Commissioner will come back to the legislature in January 2013 and will recommend to the legislature the funding mechanism and the taxes to be raised, including but not limited to a payroll tax, an income tax, and other taxes that may need to be considered. That I thought was interesting. And I got to thinking about it, and given my initial model that I did, which I've got some updates coming on that, it looked to me to fully fund this thing was going to be a 21% payroll tax, which would be punishing to both the employer and the employee.
21% divided equally between employer and employee, or
I don't know, but if given what the original idea was, it was like what a 3-to-1 kind of 4-to-1 kind of ratio. You know, obviously less for the employee, but that would be a tough nut to crack. So I began to think, well, if there were changes to the income tax, which have been proposed through the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission to go from the Fed taxable to the adjusted gross, in other words, the state looking at not what your taxable amount is after your federal deductions, but what is it on the front page of your 1040. That's a big difference in what would be taxable. And also a broad-based style tax like a GST or something like that.
What's a GST?
Goods and services tax.
Oh, like a VAT tax or value-added tax.
Right, or a VAT tax, something like that, where instead of a 6% sales tax just on goods, there are 3 times the number of services being transacted in the state of Vermont than there are just sales of goods. It would bring in a lot more tax, even if you reduce the rate. So the theory has been out there, if you had a GST at 4.5, you'd raise a whole lot more than the 6% sales tax, you know, those kinds of mechanisms. And it got me very worried. And the reason I was concerned about this, being a numbers person, I'm a native Vermonter. I think we struggle economically in the state, generally speaking. And this could be very, very, very difficult for the state in terms of economic growth, providing jobs, providing an attractive environment for younger people to stay or return home. I have 2 kids in college. This is personal for me. And I'd like them to be able to, at least one of them, be able to stay in my home state and their home state. So it got me concerned about what's the real economic impact here. I don't know that the legislature has really thought enough about that. I really hope that they put some laser sharp focus on that in the next next half of the biennium, even if they didn't have time to do so last year.
What would the harm be for the state to simply wait and let the federal health care reform bill begin to roll out and take effect? I mean, how does what we're trying to do here in Vermont kind of interface with, well, critics call it Obamacare, but the federal plan? I mean, why should we simply not wait and let that come into play?
Well, all states were required to either create an exchange, which is part of the Act 48. There's 2 parts to it. One is the creation of the exchange. The other is the Green Mountain Care proposal. And
Act 48 is the legislation that was passed by the
formerly H202.
Right.
So each state is required to either set up an exchange or the Fed will set it up for you. So I think states are probably smart to set up their own exchange. So at least they can call the shots on how they want it to be.
And an exchange is where people call or email or send a message to and say, hey, I want to buy some health insurance, or I need health insurance. Where do I go to get it? Is that the idea behind it?
Yes, it is. And also at the federal level, the idea is there that a lot of small employers really have gotten to a point where they really can't afford it. And so therefore, they would basically be shifting their employees to go look at the exchange for their healthcare needs.
Okay.
That's really, and that there would be theoretically a lot of different options in the exchange. One thing that concerns me about Vermont is that we have very few insurance players here. Our exchange is going to be extremely limited. In fact, our exchange may end up being a single payer right off the bat if there is only one insurance provider, and the legislation does provide for that possibility.
So the one provider would be like an insurance company? Is that
like
it,
Blue Cross Blue Shield would be the likely candidate.
All right. So one of the other issues that I remember hearing a lot about back last spring is how do businesses that already self-insure their employees, like IBM was frequently mentioned, but also I think the teachers union, for instance, has its own insurance policy. How do they play into that? Would they be forced to basically participate in this whole pool or in the exchange by paying their share of it, but at the same time they'd be able to keep their their own insurance plans and continue to self-insure, or does that go by the wayside as well?
My understanding of the exchange piece is that large groups would be exempt. So any group that's over 100 employees, which would cover anything like an IBM, obviously, and some association groups. Although I think at the end of the day, associations as providing health insurance kind of go away. That's my understanding. So there would be groups that would be exempt, and even in Green Mountain Care, even if this transitions pretty quickly or the waivers come sooner and the Green Mountain Care can be established sooner through the exchange or morph the exchange to that, I think you're talking about situations where you have what are called the ERISA employers, which is the IBMs of the world who are self-funded, that they may be exempt if they wish to be. The question came up that very day that I heard the governor speak about what his plan was. Would IBM have to pay the payroll tax even if they keep their own insurance plan? The governor's answer at that time was yes, that was his thought, because and for good reason, because then he's got more money coming in to support the Green Mountain Care proposal for people who aren't even using the benefit. But later on, it became clear that IBM and a few large employers weren't real happy with that idea. They had a meeting with the governor, and I think it's probably common opinion that the state would recognize that they would have an economic issue as well as a policy issue if they were to force that, if they were able to. And so I think there'd be some difficult problems saying to IBM, well, if you've got your own insurance plan, you're going to have to pay the payroll tax too.
All right.
I would assume, and I have assumed in my projection, that those employers do not have to participate and do not have to pay the payroll tax. Another very important economic aspect of this is about the percentage of the payroll tax, and if you are an employer that has higher level employees, higher wage employees versus lower wage employees. The proposal that I see that really has been put together with Green Mountain Care, if 11% payroll tax is what we're talking about, it may end up being more on the employer, favors low-wage companies. It discourages high-wage companies because companies like IBM can put out their insurance policy for their people cheaper than 11% on payroll when your average employee is $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. If you are Walmart and you got a bunch of part-timers, and right now you're only covering a certain group that works full-time with healthcare benefits, this 11% might be a real boon to you. So there's going to be some winners and losers in that regard, but what concerns me about that with economics is I think this state wants to encourage high-wage companies because that supports a younger demographic, the ability for our kids to stay here and earn a living, but to encourage low-wage employers is probably not a good policy direction. I have a concern about that.
Well, let me ask, is it a realistic option to do nothing? I mean, if
it's not.
If we were just say, well, you know what, now that we've looked at this a little more closely, oh my gosh, way too much more money, we can't afford it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Do we just sort of say, well, I guess we're stuck with the status quo?
I don't think that's an answer either.
So what should we do instead?
I've thought a lot about this because ever since I started putting this projection together, and believe me, as a treasurer of a fairly large city in this state, we spend $3 million a year on health care. Yeah. And it goes up every year, Andrew, and it's just craziness. So, do we need reform? Yes, we need reform. I just don't think this is it. I think this is nothing more than a morph of what we already got going on. It's just that we're changing who the payer is. We're changing from a private-public system to a completely public system, sort of, with the exception of the ERISA folks and the military and the Medicare, although those are public. So are we really changing? Are we really getting out of the box? I really don't think we are. And my hope is at the end of the day that folks in Montpelier will recognize that this thing is a loser economically and it's going to harm the state. And we shouldn't go down that road. But what we should be doing is we should be looking at best practices in large private sector groups to find out what they're doing to improve outcomes, lower the cost of healthcare, and serve people correctly. What I've seen in some of the research I've done is that there was a recent survey that was done by the Society of Human Resource Managers, a really great outfit. It's a national organization, it's Human Resources Association. And what their response was, and a lot of the active members are larger company HR folks. What is private industry doing? What have they done to keep the rates down? The first and foremost was wellness. Wellness, but not just, oh, we're just going to put on a wellness fair and let everybody participate. No, we're talking aggressive wellness. Companies like Safeway, if you are an employee of Safeway, if you smoke, you pay more for your insurance, or your benefit package isn't as good for the same amount that you're paying in as your counterpart in your company who doesn't smoke. So what this is really trying to modify folks' behavior, driving them to wellness in a very aggressive way, to say, you can have that behavior, but you will have a consequence for that behavior, a fiscal consequence, whether it's a reduction in benefit or an increased premium. And we can do this across the board, even folks who are Medicaid covered.
I've often wondered,
skin in the game is important here.
I've often wondered about this very point. It's kind of fascinated me and intrigued me a lot, because like you, I think, and like Safeway, I guess, I feel like somebody who willfully undertakes risky behavior, like smoking, for instance, really should pay somehow. And if somebody who is making a dedicated effort to maintain a healthy lifestyle, goes to a gym or something like that, or gets a lot of exercise, should be rewarded by getting a discount of some sort, or at least some kind of benefit out of it. But it seems like once you get down into the weeds of this, I mean, how do you sort of encourage someone who may be obese, in strictly medical terms, to lose weight? I mean, who makes that judgment?
Well, if you're incented with a pocketbook,
True, but I mean, I think on the one hand, the smoking thing is a fairly easy one to figure out. But although people will lie about it, I think it's easier to lose
weight than it is to quit smoking.
Well, yeah,
and I'm not a smoker, but
I've tried to do both, and but I just wondered. It's easy for people to lie about stuff like that.
Well,
I would think
that's going to show up. I mean, if you're getting if you are getting an analysis of your health, a checkup on a routine basis, and that's part of wellness too, is having a routine, once a year, thorough physical exam. I mean, somebody who smokes, doc isn't missing that. They put that stethoscope on your lungs, you're breathing. They know if you smoke or not. There's just no question. Okay. But I think that's one area, but there's a couple other pieces too. What else have been the best practices out there in large groups? Greater cost sharing on the healthcare expense. In other words, and this is the high deductible plan issue. You probably heard of this. For example, the city of Rutland just went to a high deductible healthcare plan. A deductible for a family of $5,000 a year. Now, the city of Rutland is actually kicking in quite a bit of that deductible. But because because the insurance picks up after $5,000, the cost of our premiums are a lot less. So that's another way that companies, and almost every municipality in the state has now gone to these high deductible plans to really curb the cost, because it's gotten to be a huge expense for the taxpayers. Greater share in pharmaceutical costs, those kinds of things, greater cost sharing, so that we're really driving consumer decisions. Do you want a generic or not? I mean, how do you know if you've got to pay for part of this, right?
Right.
I'm going to take the generic if I can possibly use it. I mean, that's just one example. Another piece that has come to my attention that I think is something that's very doable in a state the size we are. We're 621,000 people. Nationwide, people who operate big health groups, that's a small group for them. I mean, there's so much we could do if we could embrace more creative solutions to this. And I think this is where, those large groups are going. How about crafting individual insurance plans? When you buy insurance for your house or your car, you're deciding what you're going to cover and at what level. Can you accept a $500 deductible on collision or not? You're making those decisions, right? This thing, as proposed, will be very limited decisions. I don't see a high deductible health care plan in here for a healthy person. That's a great deal.
One size fits all sort of thing.
It's a one size fits all. Why? I heard an example. I was watching a videotape of this was congressional testimony about from the Medicare actuary. They were talking to him, and one of the congressmen said, I got this constituent who called me, and he said he's got this pre-existing condition on bursitis, which is not life-threatening, but it's it's a hassle, but, he's got bursitis maybe in his elbow or something. And a guy said, I really want to just get insurance, but they're denying me because of this pre-existing condition. He said, can you write me a policy that exempts that? That's a tailoring of a particular thing where, I can deal with my bursitis. I can live with my bursitis. I know how to treat it. I don't have to have coverage for that, but can you cover me for everything else? So could we get to that real individual tailoring so that we're reducing the cost of care because we're really caring for the things that really concern us that we might need to worry about rather than the things we don't? So, I think there's a lot of creative solutions out there. I don't see that this proposal and this legislation is aiming us in that direction. I think it's taking us over here in this direction, which kind of is more of the same, but with a few other inherent problems. And so I know that's a long way of saying that I have...
Yeah, it's possible to,
I have concerns, but...
let me just take a couple of additional minutes here, if we can, just to, because you had mentioned something about hospitals earlier, and I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to talk about. I'm not sure if at the time you were talking about a provider tax, which was kind of a big deal issue I remember hearing about in the spring, but
that's still a big issue.
We have a couple of minutes. I think we can just try and get to that. Is that how does that provider tax work, and how is that going to be involved in the Green Mountain Care proposal as it stands now?
Well, part of the funding of Medicaid today is the Medicaid Global Commitment. We actually have an agreement, the state of Vermont, have an agreement with the federal government that we'll capitate our increases at 6 to 8% per year or something like that. We just renewed the agreement last year. And in exchange for keeping our rate of increase at a constant, we get a little bit more money from the feds. Well, part of that whole pool of money is the money from the feds with some ERA money. There's also tobacco settlement money, and there's also provider taxes. So what we're doing in the state of Vermont is we're partly, a small part though, funding our Medicaid costs. This is, low-income healthcare, by taxing the providers that are serving these people, but yet taking a lower reimbursement for serving them. So in a sense, we're really taxing providers twice for this particular group.
Providers being the hospitals in this case.
And doctors.
Right. Okay.
Because they're getting the short shrift on the reimbursement.
This sounds like the cost shift question that we've heard a lot about.
Yeah, it's huge.
As someone who doesn't have insurance but goes to the emergency room, the hospital has to take care of them.
Yeah. Or even Medicaid. Medicare reimburse, I want to say it's somewhere around 80% of full cost. Medicaid reimburses, I think, at around 60% of real cost, something like that. So you can see that differential there can mean a lot.
The private insurance
that's the bigger part of your cost shift, is the under reimbursement relative to cost. Because what's happening is those of us covered by private insurance, we're paying the cost or more. Right. So every of $3 of care that my insurance company would pay for, $1 of it is the cost shift. It's shocking, but that's true. One question I've got about this whole proposal, and I haven't really figured out a way to quantify it, but once this becomes, it's going to be a quasi-single payer, it won't be a true single payer, but once it becomes a Green Mountain Care fully enveloped system, where does the cost shift go? So there's another question about how can this contain costs when you have this cost share thing always increasing year after year after year, because there's a group within this whole world, the Medicaid folks, for whom the state and the federal government isn't really owning up to the total cost of their care. So it's going to be the responsibility of the state through the single payer mechanism. So that means that the taxes that are being raised, whether it's payroll income or whatever, will have to keep pace with that and have to cover that, I think. So I haven't found another way to think of it, but it's got to go somewhere.
Well, then just to wrap up, so can we expect anything new out of the legislature on this in 2012? Or is it just a case where the 5-member board is going to continue to play around with the numbers and come up with some elaboration of what they already did last year?
The only thing I've actually seen in some documents I've reviewed is that there's an expectation that Secretary of Administration Jeb Spalding will report to them on some sort of thought process on the financing mechanism. Okay. Which would obviously relate to the taxes and possibly, how that works with the Medicaid Global Commitment. They won't be talking about benefit packages yet. They're probably not going to be talking about cost, but they're going to be talking about a funding mechanism. So my guess is there that if there was any discussion about income tax, and there's been some rumblings about changing that, that's when you see that bill get introduced. So look for that this winter, because if we're changing the income tax formula from net fed taxable to AGI, that could happen this year. The other thing is, if this begins in 2014 and enrollment starts in January, in the fall of 2013 for January 2014, there has to be some significant funding in place before this begins, before, the drop dead date of starting the coverage, even through the exchange. So I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. I don't have any information on it. I'm just saying it'll be interesting to see what really occurs.
Indeed it will. Well, Wendy, thank you very much for being with us today and helping us kind of explore this incredibly complicated, complicated to me anyway, scenario about healthcare. And we'll see. And I'm sure folks who are interested in learning more might want to plan to go up to Burlington on Tuesday, November 8th, and attend the panel discussion, the conference, or the forum on healthcare that you'll be attending, a forum on the future of healthcare in Vermont. And Sally Pipes, a Chief Executive Officer with the Pacific Research Institute, will be your main speaker, and you'll be on a panel with several other folks here and well-known in the state, and should be an interesting afternoon.
If people want my projection, they can actually obtain it at vthealthcarefreedom.org.
Okay.
That organization has put it up on their website, and there'll be a change to that probably next week before the event in Ludlow. And so they can look for it there. It's vthealthcarefreedom.org.
Okay, and there you have it. Well, thank you all for listening today, and great to be back with you, and we'll see you again in the next couple of weeks. Thanks again.